So I'm Chitty Parikh. I'm the Executive Director of Integrative Health and Medicine program at New York Presbyterian. And one of the questions I often get from patients when I tell them I do integrative medicine is, what exactly is that? You know, what kind of patients do you see? What kind of diseases do you treat? And I always tell people, I don't treat diseases. I don't treat symptoms. I treat people. Because there is a big difference between the two. Because I can have two people walk into my door in my office with exact same diagnosis, exact same label on them. But how I treat them is going to be vastly different. Because health is very personal. Each person comes with their unique health journey. It is a combination of so many different aspects of our lives and our experiences, a combination of years and years of just life. We often tend to focus on just the physical aspects of health. But healing is not about getting rid of a disease or a symptom. It's about creating a strong foundation of health. And what is health? So the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, social well-being, not just absence of disease. So how can we expand our perspective to take into consideration and respect the story of each individual and make it the central focus of the healing process? Ancient medicine in all parts of the world recognized this for thousands of years. And in my opinion, it is a far more elegant, individualized type of medicine than modern medicine. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, actually said, it's far more important to know what person has the disease than what disease the person has. That is why we have to account for all aspects of our well-being that makes us who we are. Our mind, our body, our spirit, our community, the environment that we live in. They're all part of us. Only then can we truly understand and appreciate each person's unique health journey. I could not think of a better person than Christopher Bailey to demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about. With his role as the arts and health lead at the WHO and his background as an actor and a playwright, he's going to bring his vivid and gripping story to life today. It is my utmost pleasure to introduce Christopher Bailey. Thank you.
You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you till you take my sunshine away. The other night, dear, while I was sleeping, I dreamt I held you in my arms. When I awoke, dear, I was mistaken. So I held my head and I cried, you are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you till you take my sunshine away. That was a song that my father sang to me to help me go to sleep at night when I was a child. Because I was afraid of the dark. I can remember the moon shining through the trees, through my window, and casting its light like a shadow puppet show against the wall. And in the movement of the branches and the leaves, I saw monsters. Now, many years later, I get some comfort of knowing what is going on in the brain that made me see those monsters. You see, the visual cortex represents 1/5 of the brain's capacity. It is a tremendous amount of computing power. And in the first instance, its main function is to take all of this incredible amount of information that our eyes bring to our brain and actually filter it, to sort through it, to reduce it so that we can make sense out of it all. And when, such as at night, the brain is not receiving the information it needs to make sense out of the world, it begins to look for faint patterns and draws on our subconscious, draws on our memory and our imagination to create a pattern. But often, it gets it wrong. I experienced this when I started losing my sight, slowly over time and on an almost daily basis. There was a time when, in Geneva, at WHO, at the headquarters, where I was taking my lunchtime walk in a park nearby, where I saw a palm tree in the middle of this Swiss park. Now, I knew it was an hallucination because it was clear. My vision had been declining for some time. But what happened was my brain would see a faint pattern of treeness and then draw from my memory, from my imagination, a tree. It just happened to get the wrong one. And I began to realize what the Buddhists have known for a long time. It's not that life is an illusion, but our perception of life is. When we see the world, the light isn't like a movie shining through the lens of our eyes and projecting on the screen at the back of our head. It turns that information into biochemical signals, which our visual cortex processes, and then creates a hallucination of the world that, if it is working normally, has some direct relationship to objective reality around us. When it's not working normally, we call that a problem, an abnormal condition, but both are illusions. This propensity to be misinformed by what we see, we've seen in the pandemic, we've seen in multiple situations, and sometimes it's a product of what we wish could be. A number of years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I was actually given 6 months to live. Spoiler alert, I lived. Through the chemotherapy, I was having an extreme reaction to it. My feet developed blisters, my mouth began to develop blisters, I couldn't speak, I couldn't hold things, I couldn't walk. I was suffering, but I was being cured of this disease. At the same time, my glaucoma was getting worse. And one of the things that I read on the indications of the package of chemotherapy was that one of the side effects was neuropathy. And I thought to myself, well, if losing my sight is the price that I have to pay for being with you here today, then it's worth it. There was only one problem with this theory. It wasn't true. If you actually look at the research, chemotherapy does not affect the optic nerve at all. In fact, the optic nerve is misnamed. It's not made up of nerve cells at all. But because it was a set of facts that fit my mental model of what I wished it would be, I automatically believed it. And that's why we need the scientific method, to test out our mental models and make sure that what we're believing, what we think we're seeing, actually holds up. Now, when we look up at the sky at night, and we see the stars scattered randomly, our brains cannot accept this notion of randomness, and so we project an order on it, drawn from our unconscious, drawn from our stories, and we project that onto the stars, and we call that constellations. When I first began to realize that I had a problem, I came to it slowly because in glaucoma there is no pain. It happens slowly over time. And I wrote it off to other things, such as fatigue, stress, whatever. But when I finally came to the ophthalmologist to check out what was going on, I remember that moment when he was looking through the machinery at my eye and examining through my eye the optic nerve. And I heard this gasp. And I thought, uh-oh. And he said, Mr. Bailey, you have lost 95% of the mass of your optic nerve. Your ocular pressure is through the roof, and if we don't intervene now with beta blocker medication, you're going to be completely blind by the end of the year, tops. And I said, okay, so the beta blockers are going to bring back my sight? No, all it can do is reduce the ocular pressure and slow the damage for a time. There are 4 regimens of beta blockers. Your body may develop a resistance to one, and then we'll bring in another, but there are only 4 that we have. Okay, what about surgery? What about some technique to regenerate my optic nerve? There is no cure. Okay, what am I going to do? What are you saying? And he said, I don't want you to fall to the tyranny of hope. So you're telling me there's no hope? And he said, no, but the hope isn't in a miracle that this misfortune might just disappear. The hope is finding the assistive technology, the white cane, the tinted glasses, which are like ski goggles. They help the washed out vision see a little bit more contour. And adapting and transcending. That's the hope. Hope is not about a vain fantasy of a misfortune disappearing or the rest of the world changing, things that you have no power over. Hope is transforming yourself to meet that challenge and rise above it. I said, you're telling me I need to have a white cane? That I have to have tinted glasses? Am I supposed to have a tin cup and sell pencils? I mean, no. No, that's not me. And he said, what's that on your forehead? I said, I don't know. And he brought me to a mirror. He said, look carefully. What's that on your forehead? And like a string of Christmas tree lights, I had a row of bruises of different colors, red, yellow, green, blue, purple. And I said, oh yeah, I got this one bumping my head into the corner of a kitchen cabinet, and I got this one falling down the stairs, and I got this one running into a lamppost, and I got this one trying to plug in an electrical plug into the socket in the wall, and I hit the wall. And that bruise under your eye, how did you get that? Well, that was in the men's room when I was at the urinal. How did you bruise your head on a urinal? I said, no, it wasn't the urinal. I was preparing to use the urinal, and there was somebody already there. It happens. And he said, you need to have the cane. So that got me to thinking about this idea of hope. What is hope? Hope is not a retreat into fantasy. And I began to think about hope today in particular, in this post-pandemic period that we're emerging into, and thinking about the pandemic of anxiety that particularly our youth are feeling right now, where they've been isolated, their dreams have been interrupted, and they have less and less confidence and faith of people in our generation of making the right decisions to keep this planet inhabitable, to keep a sense of justice and fairness, to ensure our safety, equity, and that we're just not going to kill each other. How do you instill hope in this situation right now? And in my mind, I go back 70,000 years to the midpoint in the brief life of our species, where there was something called the cognitive revolution, where our midbrains reformed. In that moment, we had the first evidence on a cave wall of an imaginative painting. Up until that point, for thousands of years, you had paintings of hunters and the animals they hunted and relatively realistic line drawings that for thousands of years didn't actually change. It was the same style all over the world, which is kind of curious in and of itself. But at that moment, you had a picture of a human body with an animal's head, something that does not exist in nature. That was the beginning of creativity. But it was also the beginning of science, because for science to exist, you need to be able to imagine a hypothesis that you then test. So arts and science actually come from the same root, the magic what if. And at that point, 70,000 years ago, when you went to a healing ceremony, when you went to a performance, a religious ceremony, a political ceremony, whatever you want to call it, it was the same ceremony. There was no difference. And even today, religion, science, and the arts share some common DNA. At about the same time in the fossil record, you have the first evidence of a healed broken femur. Now let's think about that for a moment. Up until that point, in the millions and millions of years in the history of life on this planet, there wasn't a single instance of a creature recovering from a wound that grievous. So why did it start happening? Because in order for a broken leg to be healed, the clan had to decide first that it was possible that that person could recover. Second, to develop techniques that would allow that person to recover. Third, that clan had to decide to put itself at risk in order to save a vulnerable member, and that they had to imagine in the future that that was actually worthwhile. And the fact that this happened at about the same time as the first imaginative drawing suggests that hope is a creative act. A few thousand years later, or many tens of thousands of years later, you actually have archaeological evidence of how this unified ceremony began to split off in an almost asexual reproduction. Now, my kids loved Greek mythology, and we would read it at night. And for one vacation, we took them to Greece to see the ruins. And in the evenings, we would read the Greek myths and play the parts so that the next day, when we saw the ruins, it wouldn't just be a pile of rocks, but it would be Delphi. You know, this is the place where Oedipus was warned that that woman looks awfully familiar, and that man is behaving a little bit like you. You better not be too angry. And being an old thespian, I was always drawn to the ancient Greek amphitheaters because they have these perfect acoustics. And much to the chagrin of my sons, I would practice my classical monologues in the amphitheaters for the tourists. And I noticed that whenever you saw an ancient Greek theater, right next to it you saw an ancient Greek hospital. Why? Because the Greek conception of health was that in the morning you would go to the temple of Asclepius, the hospital, and you would bathe in the waters of Hygienia and purge your body. And in the afternoon you would go to the temple of Dionysus, the theater, and you would purge your soul. That was the division between the two that was happening. The Greeks' notion of theater was that in this magic circle, theater itself means a place to behold. It is a place of resurrection, of revelation, and redemption, where for an hour or two, you can place yourself into the spirit of another and begin to navigate the troubles of your times. It was a place of physical healing, of mental healing, of communal healing. So, fast forwarding a few thousand years, I've been told that I have glaucoma. I've been told I have to use the cane. I'm also told, as part of this idea of hope, that I'm going to slowly, my brain is going to use its neuroplasticity and lay down new neural pathways to my other senses. And I thought, how am I going to know that? What's going to happen? And the first sign of it was very small. It was at work. I was at the water cooler, and I was filling up a glass of water, and I wasn't really paying attention to it. And the person next to me said, "How did you do that?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You didn't look, and you filled up that glass of water to the top without spilling. How did you do that?" And I thought about it for a moment, and I thought, well, you know, when you fill a container with liquid, the pitch rises. I now know the pitch of a full glass of water. I was entering the world of sound. So my mentor brought me to the streets of Lausanne at night, and the goal here on this busy thoroughfare was to learn how to walk down the street without getting myself killed. So to make matters more interesting, she blindfolded me, and she said, "I want you to walk, and just don't walk into traffic. That's the goal." And I was terrified. I mean, how am I going to do this? So I start walking, and sure enough, you know, I hit the curb, and she pulls me back and says, "Okay, now try again. Listen to the sound of the cars passing by and imagine it, that Doppler sound of woo, 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 as a line pointing to the horizon. You try and use that line to walk parallel to it." And I thought, okay. So I'm walking, and I'm trying to imagine walking parallel to this line, and I end up going too far the other direction, and I start hitting the stairs of the buildings to my left. And she said, "That's normal, because parallel isn't actually parallel. Imagine like in a Renaissance painting where you have a horizon line and a road leading to it. It's actually a triangle. And the parallel lines meet that horizon line at a point that's called the vanishing point. And in the painting, it's an actual physical limitation. But in our minds, it actually indicates something going on forever. Two parallel lines going off into eternity. The same principle holds true with sound. If you can imagine you're walking as the parallel line, then you have to actually meet the sound of the cars at the vanishing point in order to be safe. Try it again. So I start walking, and I'm trying to walk into the vanishing point, and every fiber of my body is telling me, "Don't do it. You're going to kill yourself. You're going to walk into traffic." But I had to put that aside and believe that if I walk to that vanishing point, I will be safe. I had to train myself to stop fearing that point. The next phase of my transformation happened in Washington, D.C. I was at a meeting, and it was just before Easter, and at the National Cathedral, there was a performance of Mozart's Requiem. And I loved the piece, but as I was listening to it this time, I was hearing the incredible swelling of music, and I realized that Mozart was depicting in the music the actual form of grief. And I began to feel my own grief of losing my connection to the world, of feeling outcast, of feeling pariah, of feeling disconnected, that it was a kind of a death. And then the music would subside, and there would be this gentle, delicate, soft part, and you would think, okay, now it's over. And then it would swell again, just like in the grieving process. But as I was listening to it, something happened. And it wasn't just listening to the pitch or the dynamics or the rhythm. I began to hear that sound passing through the matter around me. The Mozart began to inhabit the Gothic arches. I could feel the texture of the stone through the quality of the sound passing through it. I could sense the soft flesh of the people singing and the hardwood pews. And I realized that what was blossoming inside my head was echolocation. That it was a world of sound was being created as my visual cortex began to connect to my auditory functions. And rather than feeling exiled from the world, I felt an immediacy, a palpable sense of connection. Because when you think about it, vision, sight, what is it? It's light hitting the surface of an object, so it's literally superficial. But sound moves through matter, and that energy that passes through the room passes through me as well. And I felt a more profound sense of present moment and connection. And even then, this body that I had felt had become a prison was beginning to transform, and that darkness, that emptiness, rather than feeling like I was imprisoned inside my body, I felt like it was now a profound opportunity for contemplation without the distraction and noise of sight. That instead of a prison, my body had become a womb. And I began to think about music. And I began to think about my father-in-law who had suffered from Alzheimer's and had been a pianist his entire life. And he couldn't remember what a piano was. He couldn't remember playing the piano. But when he sat down at the piano, the muscle memory would come back and he would play. And the expression on his face, which normally would be contorted in anxiety because he couldn't remember where he just was or what he was about to do. And it was like he was constantly waking up from a bad dream, but all the time. While he was playing, his face relaxed. And he felt a profound sense of contentment. And it didn't reverse the condition. It didn't cure him at all. But it gave him a moment of respite. And I began to think about some of the writings of Jean-Philippe Rameau, the Baroque French composer, and he played the harpsichord, and the harpsichord doesn't play chords, right? It plays individual notes. And he talked about how when we listen to music, we hear the note that was just played, we hear the note that's playing now, and we imagine the note to come, and it already forms a chord in our imagination. And when we're surprised by that note, it wasn't what we were expecting, we have a different reaction. The anticipation is a dopamine reaction, and then the surprise of something that makes sense but is now something new gives us a shot of serotonin, which gives us a sense of awe. It is literally a catharsis, and it's the subject of every profound piece of theater, of every rhyming couplet, of every punchline of a joke. It's when something is a surprise, but also has a feeling of inevitability. Because when you think about it, it's an opposite. And that opposite neurologically creates a vacuum, and nature, abhorring a vacuum, lays down a new neural pathway. And that neural pathway is defined by your own perspective, by your own experience, your own imagination, and it's not the product of the artist itself. This is the learning opportunity for behavior change, for alteration, for transformation that the deep aesthetic experience can provide. But more than that, it actually heals broken time. The temporal lobe in the left hemisphere of the brain is a wonderful gift to us because in that spot where we have both a sense of past and future, Our sense of past allows us the opportunity to learn from that past, and our sense of the future allows us the opportunity to plan, which gives us a tremendous evolutionary advantage. But it comes at a terrible cost, because with that sense of past comes a profound sense of loss. And with that sense of future comes a profound anxiety of dread. And that's the source of much of human suffering. But with music, you can reunite the past, the present, and the future in a harmonious chord. And we can start living more fully in the present moment, and yet still have it be unified to the past and the future. And in our society today, where we live so much in the past and the future, we live so much in a world of loss and dread, that can be a blessing. But the most profound aspect of hearing that music at that time was realizing that my world, which had seemed so polluted, so dirty from my reduced vision, suddenly, with this echolocation, I could see a world through sound that was strange but beautiful. And I could imagine beauty again. Just as you willingly close your eyes to better savor a glass of red wine, just as you willingly close your eyes to better embody a beautiful piece of music, just as you willingly close your eyes to trace the gentle slope of a lover's forearm, so too do I accept the closing of my eyes to better share this moment with you. But my transformation was not complete. Yes, I learned how to cope. Yes, I rediscovered beauty. But that was just for me. How could I use these skills for someone else? I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that because every person who loses their sight goes through an almost identical journey, that this is because these skills, the echolocation, the enhanced sense of empathy, as a sense-making tool, as a navigational tool, is actually a fail-safe built into our DNA. And what that means from an evolutionary perspective is that it's expected that in society we should have a certain number of blind people. Why? If not because the skills that they develop are an essential contribution to the community. And that gives rise to the myths of the blind people who can see into the future. All of that's nonsense, of course, or can hear better than us. My hearing hasn't changed, but the way my brain processes sound has. I am, in fact, not disabled. I have different abilities. But what good is that? I discovered that actually in my cancer experience, where as I was coping with the pain of the chemotherapy, one of the things that I foolishly did was I wrote a play. I got it produced here in New York on the AIDS epidemic. But what I discovered was that during that process of working with the actors on stage, even though when I wasn't on stage, I couldn't walk, I couldn't talk, I couldn't hold things because of the blistering, on that stage, I felt a profound sense of well-being. Now, was that because of increased endorphin production that had an analgesic effect? Was it distraction? Was it focus? Was it all of the above? Was it none of the above? I don't know, but it was real, but it wasn't permanent. And when I got home, I would take off my shoes and my socks would be bloody and I couldn't speak anymore. But I had that moment of respite. Now, it is true measurably that the deep aesthetic experience does lower cortisol levels. So maybe I put myself into a more healing mode. But let's say it hadn't worked. Let's say that I had passed, that I had died. That passing would have had an authentic personal meaning that would have been an act of grace for myself and the people that I love. So as I was writing these things down in Facebook posts, this interesting thing began to happen. There was this community of people who were living with cancer, dealing with it, that began to informally form. And we were able to share with each other things that you can't share with a loved one because they can't hear it. And people would come and go. When they left, it was because they were cured or they weren't. But there was this one woman, her name was Kate, and she lived in San Diego. I never met her. She also had colon cancer, but hers was stage 4 rather than stage 3. And from her description, I knew enough about my own research into the etiology of the disease that her prognosis was dire. She wasn't likely to live. And yet, her optimism was so complete and so infectious that I believed, as did she, that she was going to live. And she watched what she ate, she visualized positively, she did yoga, she did all the things that you're supposed to do to create this healing environment. And I was absolutely convinced that she was going to beat this disease. But like me, she also had a profound fear that if she were to pass, she dreaded the pain that would cause her husband and her 2 boys. I also had 2 boys. And so to comfort her, I gave her a suggestion of how I thought I could take control over this fear. And what I did was I wrote letters to my sons that would mark the major milestone events in their lives should I not make it there, so that I could participate in some way. Their high school graduation, their wedding, birth of the first child, that sort of thing. And she thought that was a good idea, so she went and she bought some nice stationery, she bought some calligraphic pens, she lit candles, she sat at this nice desk, and when she sat down to write these letters to her children in the future, she stared down at that bone-white page, and she suddenly had a premonition that if that black ink touched the whiteness of that page, she would die. And she couldn't do it. And then she felt bad about it, and then I felt bad about it because I was the one who gave her the idea. And then I had an idea. I said, there's this thing called sense memory. We know that visual information is more distancing. The neurological path that it takes goes from the visual cortex, from the optic nerve to the visual cortex, back to the cerebral cortex, and then finally to the midbrain, to the amygdala, and to the lizard brain. It's a very convoluted path, but it's one of the reasons why visual information is so conscious. Whereas auditory information, olfactory information, goes directly to the midbrain and directly to the hippocampus and unlocks long-term memories. Proust discovered it, Stanislavski discovered it, Freud discovered it, all within a decade. So we use those techniques for her to start imagining what that high school graduation would be like for her son, and imagining the texture of the stubble on his chin and the bit of razor burn, or what the spouse that he brought home to be married to smelled like, or looking at the child, the grandchild being born, and seeing the glimmer in the corner of the eye that was identical to her father's, or celebrating the 50th wedding anniversary with the husband and seeing the lines on his face crinkle up as he told the same joke that he's been telling for 50 years and it's still not funny. And we went through her life step by step, marking it in concrete sensorial ways. Then a few weeks later, I saw on Facebook that she had died. And the eruption of grief was heartbreaking across the country. It was like the emotional fabric, the tapestry of her life threatened to become unraveled because this thread had been pulled. Now, There was nothing remarkable about this woman. She was not rich. She never started a business. She wasn't famous. She never had a peer-reviewed paper. But she lived. After a few days, I reached out to her husband and I explained who I was. And he responded that he knew who I was. He didn't know what we talked about. That was her business, but he was aware. And I said, in memory of Kate, I would be happy to be your sounding board. Whatever you want to talk about. And he said, let me think about it. And a few days later, he said, I'm going to take you up on your offer. And we got on Zoom. And he said, like me, he was absolutely convinced that she was going to recover because she was convinced that that hope had led to this illusion that she was going to get better. So much so that when she went into the hospital for the final time, he didn't take off any work, and she died alone. And he said to me, what can you do about that? I said, nothing. There's nothing I can do. But then I thought, what if we ran this exercise again? And step by step, we go through these milestone moments of this life with him. He would be himself, and I would be Kate. And in her own words, in her own inflection, we would live every moment, every act of grace, every gentle gesture of a life fully lived that never happened. Do you feel that feeling? In empathy, you have 4 stages. The first stage is sympathy, an intellectual understanding of what's going on. The second is empathy, the mirror neurons, where you're feeling what someone else is feeling. Your heartbeats begin to synchronize. It's what happens in these temples of shared attention that we call theaters. And then there's compassion, which comes from the Latin. It means struggle together. It's when you find common cause with someone else, even in their vulnerability, even when there's, and especially when there's no gain for you. It is a sacrifice. But there's a 4th level, which is what you may be feeling right now, and that's that moment when you can no longer tell where her story ends and yours begins. And it has a name. We're coming to the end of our story, and I want to leave you with a thought. We live in an age where we falsely believe that one person's good fortune necessitates another person's bad fortune, and vice versa. That somehow vulnerability is not a call to a duty of care, but even in a worse circumstance is an invitation to violence. This is a lie. And Thomas Jefferson expressed it best when he said, if I light my candle with yours, your flame does not diminish, but together we make the room that much brighter. When you leave here today, I'm hoping that you will find someone whose candle you can light. That's the revolution that was fought 70,000 years ago and is still going on today. As for me, my body has built up a resistance to the medication. Blindness is now inevitable. But because of my transformation, as I walk to that vanishing point, I do so without fear, without grief, without dread. And should I falter, I know I will hear the sound of my Father's voice singing to me, comforting me, as I am drawn into the darkness, vast and immeasurable. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Christopher. I'm just going to let the silence linger for a little bit, because we're not going to move from that into a panel conversation immediately. I am going to introduce you to my colleagues here. I'll start with myself. I'm Nisha Sajnani. I'm the founding co-director of the Arts and Health at NYU and the chair of our Creative Arts Therapies Consortium. I'm joined here by my colleague, Carlos Rodriguez Perez, who's the director of clinical operations at Kingsboro Psychiatric Hospital, and prior to that, the director of wellness and recovery at Kings County, one of New York City's health and hospitals in that network, where he led a robust artist in residence program and built what is arguably the largest creative arts therapies team in a single institution. And we also have Gary Padmore with us, who is the Director of Education and Community Engagement at the New York Philharmonic, and prior to that, the Director of Education and Community for the orchestra at St. Luke's. And he's been a robust advocate for youth of color, for composers of color, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on a wide variety of things. But for right now, I'm just going to ask both of you to lead us in your own responses to what Chris has offered. And there are so many different entry points here. And hopefully in listening to some of their reflections, you might be warmed up to your own. Some of you are plenty warmed up. But I'll let them begin, and then I'll turn it over to you for your own reflections, and we'll have a mic come around for you as well. But Carlos, Gary, is there anything you'd like to reflect on in what you were listening to and feeling?
Well, I told Chris that he should have warned me before he had this monologue, because I wasn't emotionally prepared. It was so powerful, and I was really, thank you so much for that, Christopher. I mean,
Aren't I a stinker?
man, whew, it was heavy. But it really brought me into, many different, periods of emotion. In full transparency, towards the end, you were talking about this idea of vulnerability. This is so kind of bizarre. A couple of days ago, my uncle passed away, and he tragically died alone, in the Caribbean, and so thank you. And so it was, sort of interesting to kind of hear this story and process my own sort of journey through that, and how my family, my dad is feeling about that, and then understanding like what that means for me now. So I, sort of am in that moment, and I have a lot of questions, a lot of frustrations, but I'm really grateful for this opportunity to really be able to sit, and especially on this panel, and to have that moment of reflection. So that's sort of my initial response to that.
Thank you, Gary.
I am sitting with a lot of gratitude for being here and witness such a generous performance in sharing, of your story. I'm also filled with gratitude because it also speaks of the importance and the power of performance, storytelling, and sharing. And I think we're in a moment in where there's so much for us to learn with regard to our common humanity and our responsibility to each other.
Yeah.
And sort of that's what resonates. And a process that started thousands of years ago and that we're still working and trying to perfect. But for some reason, I'm naming what I'm feeling as gratitude.
Is there anyone here who would like to share some of your own reflections, responses in this moment? You could just raise a hand so that we can see you, and we'll have a mic sent over to you. And it might be that you have a response a little bit later, and that's fine too, and I'll come back and ask again. And so as we're in this conversation, just feel free to let me know. I see it already, and I happen to know this woman. All right, Chantal, the mic's coming to you.
Hi, I just want to thank you, and I felt transported. I felt transported with your story. I just felt, I was thinking about the idea of the sense that came for me, and I felt like there was this moment where I was just with you, you know, and it was beautiful to have that moment to kind of walk a little bit with you in that space to understand a bit. And again, that was I think the empathy that was coming up for me. So can you hear me? Oh, good, sorry. Okay. So I just want to say thank you for that. And, you know, Jerry and I were just talking about, this was just a beautiful delivery. It was captivating. And brave too, in terms of, because you're still going through that walk. And so I appreciate you sharing that.
If anyone had difficulty hearing, Chantal spoke about feeling transported and the gratitude that you're sitting with as well. Did I see a little flicker of a hand here? No, I just wanted to make sure. Okay. All right, I'll come back to you. So this is quite a way to bring us into a conversation about arts and health. It's embodied, it's visceral, it's grounded in the present moment in human stories. And I was thinking, Chris, about, you know, there are so many other themes that you've offered up in these stories, how we cope with past suffering, future anticipation, and how a melody, a harmony, a piece of music can unite all three, and how you united all three in the act of performance, your art form, right? Though I know you have many. And also shifts in identity and how we resist those shifts in identity. Being given a diagnosis that we don't want, weren't expecting, needing to grapple with, to later in the story saying, I'm not disabled, I have different abilities. And there's this transformational arc in that as well. So I'm going to turn back to you, Carlos, and to Gary, because, you know, there's something really interesting happening as we think about this uniting of art and health, right? So we're seeing more hospitals become galleries, and we're seeing more galleries become spaces of care. We're seeing cultural institutions fund, put resources, invest time into the care and well-being of their artists. And I know, Gary, you've led some of that within the New York Philharmonic. You've created room for that. And Carlos, you have such a long history of bringing artfulness into the hospital, both in terms of visual art, performing art, artists in residence, and creative arts therapists who really straddle that space between art and psychotherapy. So I wonder if you could speak to the value of that. Why have you decided to invest time and resources in your respective roles into this marriage between arts and health?
I guess that's me. Well, I come from being a creative art therapist. At some point, I sort of figured out there was something, and then I decided to study about it, and that's how I ended up in New York. And through my career, there have been this investigation about how these, forms of aesthetics, the arts, help organize and heal people. So in my practice as a therapist, I would see these transformations and these changes. Even though often I could not speak about what exactly did what. But yet you can see it vividly. And, but we start making those connections. I think Gary very well speaks of it doesn't matter where you go, you're going to find some aesthetic manifestation attached to culture, to healing, to spiritual practices. So there's something that the arts do that organizes and heal people. And so we have capitalized that knowledge as creative art therapists and try to figure out what is the more efficient way to organize that. So my career as a creative art therapist has been about organizing that knowledge and delivering treatment to those that we are serving in these settings. Interesting enough, the introduction of artists in residence and opening space of artists to create art for the sake of art come more out of the need of changing culture. How we take institutions and start shifting the culture of those institutions. And artists are amazing at doing that. Bringing community, asking questions, and reflecting back. Without the commitment of having to deliver a therapeutic process. The work of the artist can be therapeutic, but that perhaps is not the main aim when an artist is creating work in these spaces. And finally, the curiosity about engaging an artist in a medical setting and what that reflects back to you, to the medical community, and to have the strength and being brave enough to receive that message back, and what it does about you as an institution and as a community. So it's a very broad strokes of sort of why the arts in a medical setting.
Thank you. Gary?
Yeah, so for me, just to kind of think in this present moment, I really thought a lot about how music and art at large really has a need to be more humanized. I think a lot of times we think about, what folks are doing on stage at the Philharmonic, what a soloist might be doing, and we quite often don't see a human. We sort of just like either hear art or, it can become like very mechanical in some ways. And so that's kind of where I am now is thinking about like how to really humanize our experiences, and more specifically in education and community engagement. Within that context, I've thought a lot about, what kind of art needs to be presented to best reflect that level of, humanization, to some extent. And so, you mentioned earlier on about the my focus and advocacy around composers of color and artists of color, et cetera. For me, that was important to really help humanize the experience, because if a student is coming into a room, that looks like me, and they're only hearing Brahms, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, et cetera, for them, like that may not necessarily be an experience where it feels human for them, because they don't see themselves in that particular space. And so that's one area of how I look at this work. But also, in the last couple of years, especially at the Philharmonic, we've been thinking a lot about trauma, and how it relates to young people, to communities. And I'm also brought back to even my own period of artistry and how I felt like I had to deal with a lot of trauma myself, even as an art maker, thinking that potentially I can be healed by what I was doing, but realizing that there was a lot of harm that I was experiencing, either doing to myself or to some folks outside of me. And so we've been inviting folks in to really help us develop the tools necessary to better understand, what trauma looks like, not just thinking about a particular community or a particular person, but that all of us sort of carry it to some extent. And then what tools do we need using the arts, using music, using visual arts, et cetera, to be able to help build a bridge to broader healing? Because ultimately, I do feel like, our work should be more holistic, because it's not just about coming in and understanding the historical context or whatever it is, but there's a larger impact that it does to the human and to the soul, that I feel we don't always explore, and surprisingly in education enough. And so I've been really trying to really interrogate what that means and figure out a way to really sustain that work as we move forward. So.
I like that word sustain, because it really does make me think about how you're investing in sustainable creative practice for those who are in the orchestra. And you could do that in many ways, but you've said, well, the arts that we engage in are also a pathway where we might reflect on our past and engage more holistically in the practices that we're engaged in the art that we're making for others. And I know that in our audience today, we have people who may locate themselves more in healthcare settings, and some who locate themselves in cultural institutions, or you move between different spaces and education. And I wonder if there's anything that you're hearing here that you can relate to, or that you would like to comment on or ask a question about already. There's a hand right over here. Thank you. A mic is coming to you.
Thank you. Hi, I just wanted to comment or ask Chris. It strikes me as the journey of discovery, or I should mention that I'm blind, by the way, Chris. The journey of discovery that you went through, I see it a little bit as the process of realizing human complexity, because we grow up as children worried about how tall we are, as adults about how much money we might have. We always have this very restrictive or very restrictive parameters of what we are. And then suddenly you're forced to confront who you are, and you see much more complexity, much more potential than you ever imagined. But first you have to accept your faults, right? You have to accept this new limitation before you're able to see further than you thought. So it's not so much about, hey, I have abilities, I'm not disabled. You are disabled when it comes to sight, but you're not just about sight, right? So you have a disability, but you're not disabled. Is that how you see it? Do you see yourself more fully now that you're blind? Thanks.
More fully what? Sorry? I see.
More
fully realized?
More fully, all of the richness of your existence, your personality, your other strengths, your potential to change.
Yeah, I do feel transformed. A friend of mine, who I've known since my college days, read some of my writings on this, and he said to me, Chris, you may have lost your sight, but you found your voice. And I don't know that that makes me a better person or that my life is better, but it's certainly different. And I think it adds a perspective that has value, that is unique, that adds to the soup, But yeah, I feel transformed, but I don't feel necessarily that the skills or the vision are better. It's just different. But difference is what we want, right?
There's more to you than you imagined before, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, and I keep thinking about, that line in Hamlet, there's more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. And when we think about sight and this other world opens up when we lose it, I think about how limiting sight is to begin with, that we only see a certain set of wavelengths on the spectrum, for instance. And if you were to shine a light onto flowers or birds, shine an ultraviolet light, you would see patterns that are not visible to us because insects and birds see in ultraviolet. And there's a whole world out there of beauty and patterns that are absolutely invisible to us at all times. Yeah, and putting that into perspective, I think, is interesting. Carl Sagan famously said that the world would act on climate change immediately if we could see in infrared, because carbon dioxide absorbs heat, and if our spectrum extended to the infrared part of the spectrum, as the greenhouse effect would increase, the entire species would go blind because we would see it. You know, so I think whenever there's a change, there's a new perspective, and I think there's a resistance to new perspectives and changes when we're so married to a mental model that any doubt could shatter our sense of identity. And that's true for any religion, any political organization. The only mental models that actually embrace doubt in our society are science and the arts. And that doesn't make them better, but it does mean that they are far more tolerant. Because the other mental models, as soon as there's doubt, they exist because people believe in them. And so they feel threatened by any doubt. And that's the source of a lot of our societal discontent.
But there's also a pressure to know everything and to be, right?
And I think being accepting of what you don't know is a blessing.
Yeah, thank you.
I was thinking about, you had mentioned, when there's a constraint, we are forced to confront ourselves, and we awaken perhaps to a new level of complexity. And I was thinking about when the theater shut down, and when we couldn't perform the way that we normally would, or we couldn't gather the way that we normally would, and how in the months that followed, theater started to show up on people's phones. WhatsApp theater, right? Or people would create plays that were built off of recipe boxes that would be sent to your home, and then you could zoom in and watch somebody cook in their kitchen. But we discovered new ways of encountering each other. It was a birth of creativity that was born out of constraint, and I think we can all relate to that in some way.
Well, I think that I go back to my favorite quote from Carl Jung, who said that loneliness is not the absence of people. Loneliness is the inability to express what matters to you most. And the role of the artist is, if somebody can't find the words, can we meet them where they are and find those words together? And if there are no words, can we express it through a sound, through a gesture in the air? Can we find an image that captures that feeling? And then once we've met them there, can we take that journey together to a new place? Arts therapies are not about calming people down. And that's, I think, or if I listen to this particular Mozart two-piano concerto, is it going to cure my autism? And people believe that. And I don't think it's about that at all. I think it's about finding expression, the redemptive power of expression, and taking this journey of transformation.
I was also thinking about the word complexity, because I think part of what art allows us is to add and experience complexity. Often our society tend to be very reductive. We started earlier talking about, not treating disease, but to treating people.
Yeah.
Because that approach to treat disease is very reductive. I'm treating, this thing of you, ignoring the rest of who we are. And I think there's a great opportunity to help people to manage complexity and to become aware of everything else we are, as opposed to be just reduced to a single identity, to a disease, to an ability or inability. So we need so part of that is how can we embrace complexity in everything we are. the good and the bad that we all embodied.
Yeah, and just to kind of build on that, I mean, I think to build on both points, I think there's I'm brought back to the idea of vulnerability and also this idea of taking risks, which I think, certainly should like live in our art, but I think, quite often we can become very calculated in how we curate experiences. We'd like to have, if I'm creating an experience, I want you to have the same experience that I'm expecting you to have, or idea or concept about whatever that is. And so if anyone sort of deviates from that, it sort of opens up this sort of guarded moment. And so I think in my mind, I also think about we talk about sustainability, but there is also this longevity that's necessary for that to happen. I mean, of course, it can happen in a single experience, like what Christopher just did, over 20, 30 minutes was incredibly powerful, and I'm never going to forget that moment. But I also want to, hear Chris perform again tomorrow, and hopefully next week. And I think that's something that is necessary in our field, in our work, both in hospitals as well as in culture organizations, is how we engage people over a period of time where we can go through this journey and have responses that some of which may be in alignment or might challenge us, in our thinking, because I think there needs to be transforming happening on both sides, of the work.
And sometimes our encounters are very brief. The journey we get to walk is, but a half hour, an hour and a half. And sometimes it can be, repeat engagements over time. I really appreciate this piece too about the point of the arts therapies or any artist-led intervention where the aim is transformation of some kind is not necessarily to calm people down. I don't see a definition of help where calming people down.
Being told to calm down can be enraging.
Yes.
I just think of like the Muzak in the background in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah.
It's like,
But, goals might be embracing the complexity, living the questions themselves, or an increased sense of vitality or joy. There's a whole range of where this work might go.
And
Yes.
how do you get to that complexity? It's actually very simple. You start with listening. You start with deep observation. And we live in a society now where we're talking over each other. We have to validate ourselves by proving someone else wrong, and they're going to be stubborn. And we're not actually listening. We're not taking a journey together, and we're not ever seeing it from the other person's point of view. One of the things that I learned, for instance, when you're dealing with that crazy uncle at Thanksgiving, right, is you don't try and prove him wrong. You're never going to get there, But what you can do is say, so describe a moment in your life that made you feel that way. And they are disarmed by that often, and then they do. And then you actually begin to see it from their point of view, and then there's actually something emotionally real to discuss. And it still may not change the mind, but at least it's not this, loggerheads that, doesn't get you anywhere.
I'll have to try that tactic. Yes.
No, but I think I love the image of the uncle at Thanksgiving. It's also something that families can do very well, which is to hold discomfort. The fact that uncle will show up every Thanksgiving, you will pray that you're not sitting next to him, but he's going to be there. But you're told, you hold discomfort. We're not sending him away or not inviting him ever again to Thanksgiving to be with us. And then we develop strategies to engage and manage that. And I think there's a great invitation of while we do this exploration that we will find moments of discomfort.
Yeah.
And even in your performance, as you shared your story, there are moments that were hard, at least for me, to hold. That are, but those are moments that I try to be especially mindful. What is about that is uncomfortable, difficult, and I'd rather not hear about. So there is that invitation as we also go to see performances and shows. sometimes we're gonna love them. Some of them are gonna be transformational, and others we're gonna be like, oh my God, what a waste of my time.
Well, and I'm often asked, what's the difference between propaganda and art? You know, the negative uses of the fictional frame, right? And I actually think that the opposite. I think that in demagoguery, you try and convince people of a lie by passing it off as the truth. And in art, you try and engage people in the truth in an agreed upon lie. So it's actually the opposite. And it's that willing suspension of disbelief where you know that this is a safe space. This is not true what is happening, that allows you to have that vulnerability to step into someone else's shoes and get another perspective and to feel things that you can't afford to feel when we walk out that door. You know, whereas in demagoguery, we say something outrageous that's meant to inflame you so that our cortisol and adrenaline levels go up, and it suppresses our prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of judgment. And so even educated people, the next thing they hear are more likely to believe. And it's a form of brainwashing, really. Whereas in the deep aesthetic experience, it's much more about feeling your way through an issue, understanding a different perspective, and then when you get to that cathartic moment of learning, it's not defined by the creator. It's your own learning. It's a completely different part of the brain that's working.
Makes me think about play and clowns,
Yeah.
improvisation,
Oh, clowns.
the edge of what we can tolerate and the push just beyond that. I'm going to, hold on
Sure,
one
please.
second. I saw a hand back there, but it might not have been a hand. Hold on. Let me just take a look around to see if there's a comment rising up. Yes, there's a comment or question right here.
One of the things that I really appreciated in Christopher's presentation was the idea that there is a difference between ethereal hope and practical hope. And
Ethereal hope and
ethereal
practical
and
hope.
practical hope. And what I think about often in my own life, especially over the last few years, was the holding on to that as a way to get through. And I wonder what your experience is working in the hospital setting, using art as both an expression of and a means to hope.
Art as a means of hope.
As a means toward, as a means toward hope or an expression of it, and how that, what your experience has been in working with people.
Well, working in a hospital in the middle of this pandemic have been quite an experience, and one of my colleagues is here. And this I will tell you, you know, we and I'm gonna base specifically talk about working at Kings County. By the beginning of June, we were holding a very first memorial service because by that time we have lost 12 of our colleagues. Never mind about the many patients that we have lost by them. So how we deal with that grief in the middle of a pandemic that we're trying to understand how we can show up and remain safe, return home to our families, keep them safe, and care for the people that are showing up to our doors. And how do you sustain your team so they can keep showing up to do this work? And so we retrieve to what we know. Can we create aesthetic spaces where people can mourn and grieve? So the first step is to acknowledge and create that we were mourning and grieving and the fear. So the team that I work with developed these literally mourning rooms, spaces in which we utilize ideas to create comfort and create space for people to remember, memorialize, cry, talk, celebrate those losses, knowing that we were just at the beginning of that process. So it's holding all that, all those truths that the fear, the losses, but knowing that we had a long way in front of us before we could get a handle over this pandemic. I think so we retreated to aesthetic, interventions. And then the others were, can we create spaces for people to create art, to, for a brief moment, stop, change, and may perhaps not even think much about what was going on. And so in that sense, taking every space we could find, including hallways, for people as they were passing by to stop, do something, or just get a, refreshment and think about that. But I think we really, embrace that very difficult moment of our humanity and our frailty as we were coping with this moment. I hope I'm sort of addressing that. And I think I'm very proud of the team. They did an amazing work, and I think they're still doing that as well.
I wanted to connect this to your comment, Chris, about hope. The way that I heard it was you had understood hope as being connected to the capacity to move with change, to adapt to change, and that here in this morning space, a space of acknowledgement, a space of reflection, there's no effort to solve something or to bring closure to something. It's just to say, here I am, here's a space for you to sit with this change that is happening. Yeah. Yes, please. 1 second, the mic's coming to you.
It's not related to the arts, but to your friend Kate, with regards to hope. Do you think she knew that she had no hope? Was she putting on a brave face for herself and for others? Or
Well,
had
I
she
think she
convinced herself
believed-
there was hope?
I think she believed that if she could be positive enough, then the science didn't matter.
Okay.
And we saw this in the pandemic all the time. We saw it with the anti-vaxxers. We saw it with all sorts of different groups. That when we so embrace a mental model that has no room for doubt, we set ourselves up for a tragic fall. I think. But it's totally understandable. I knew the science. I understood that she was likely to die, and I believed her. And when I talk about hope, I'm not talking about it in terms of a universal definition, but just an experience, that's all. I think, I just get worried about the tyranny of hope when it becomes just an escape from the reality because you don't want to deal with it. Whereas I think there's an alternative that is still hopeful, that is still a way of navigating through the misfortune.
Yes, and that, in a time where we have so many challenges that feel so very enormous, it's understandable that we might want a little certainty. And what we are reflecting on here seems to be the multiple pathways to coping with uncertainty, and that might be a good thing. There's one more comment over here, and you're going to have the pleasure and privilege of being our last comment or question for the evening.
Good evening. What I'm hearing, Chris, and what I've really enjoyed from the presentation is that we want to move away from what we sometimes call toxic positivity. And the hope that I'm hearing you experience is joy. And in practicing gratitude for what we have and what we experience and find out about ourselves and that of others, then we experience joy, which keeps us hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a great last
word. Thank you so much. But you know what? It was going to be the last word, but your hand went up with such vigor that we're not going to say you can't. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Dina. I'm with an organization called Healthy Humor in the City. And the reason that I couldn't let this evening end without speaking is because you mentioned play and clowns, and someone else here talked about hope and art in the hospitals. I'm literally sitting here with 3 clowns who work in hospitals in the city. And so it's been a very interesting pandemic for us, converted to virtual, and so there were lots of digital clowning and digital interaction with patients, but now we've gone back to the floors slowly in the 5 hospitals we're in the city. And I mean, I'm not a clown, and they are, but they refuse to talk. So I just wanted to. I'm the suit of the operation, so I can just kind of witness the magic that they do. But I know that, to your point about what the healthcare workers have lived through. So I hear all of it, and I know how much of a balm the return of the clowns to the floors have been for the healthcare workers. They're like, we know we're here for the kids, but really you're here for us. So it's very powerful in a healthcare setting, and the power of play, the power of joy. I certainly know every time I have a chance to shadow them on the floors and witness what they do, it's just awe-inspiring, because it looks like it's fun and games, but as we all
there's
know
so much
here,
more going
the
on.
power of it is just stunning. So anyway, I just
And
felt the
maybe-
need to say that.
And maybe one word about joy for a moment, because when we over-medicalize health, as our speaker at the beginning pointed out, we reduce health to the absence of symptoms and illness and disease. When I was involved in the big push towards rolling out ARVs in Africa 20 years ago, and there was this notion that we just need to save as many lives as possible, to bring the symptoms under control, to bring the HIV under control with the ARVs, and then our job is done. But there was no notion of, once we've lengthened that life, do they have anything to live for? And I think it's not enough to reduce symptoms. You have to thrive. That there's a right to joy. There's a right to that pursuit of happiness, and we forget about that often in these discussions. That in the WHO definition of mental health, for instance, it's not just the absence of diagnosable conditions, but the answer to the following questions. Can you cope with the everyday stresses of life? Can you maximize your individual potential? Can you be productive? Can you contribute to a community? Can you find moments of joy? And if the answer to those questions are yes, you are mentally healthy, regardless of what diagnosable conditions you may or may not have. And clowns are a big part of that. When I'm sick in the hospital, I feel such a sense of dissociation from my body, from the doctors around me. I'm connected to these machines. And then the clown comes in, and they actually use the language of dissociation and intuitively. And you feel like, this person is my friend. I remember seeing this young girl in a pediatric oncology ward. She didn't have hair from the treatment and looked stunned, in shock, and the clown came in and had this big red-haired wig, and then looked around, saw that there was nobody there, took off the wig and saw that he was bald underneath, and said, the kid laughed, and the parents cried tears of joy because it was the first laughter they heard from this child in weeks. If that's not healing, when I was at WHO, people have said things like, what you're doing is recreational. It's not healing. And I said, listen to that word, recreation. That's healing.
Gary, Carlos, any last comments you'd like to make?
Well, I mean, I think just one thing I was thinking about leading up to this panel is the idea of me personally and even our institution focusing on our own health and wellness in order to really be the resources that we need to be for our community. Because I think quite often, we are offering our services almost at a deficit, and if we don't take the time to sort of replenish ourselves, then we're not going to be good for anyone. And so that's sort of something that I wanted to just, leave with, is just the idea and encouragement that we also hold ourselves accountable to taking care of ourselves and thinking about how the arts can replenish us and, et cetera, because I think it is essential as we think more broadly about our community. So.
Thank you.
I'm just going to say amen and amen. Yes.
That's a good place to end. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing such an amazing story, and the panelists and the audience for at least beginning to process it. I think it'll take us some time, but this is a start. And I just want to end by saying one thing that Chris mentioned is that taking that opportunity from time to time to just close our eyes, right? It's such a profound statement, because that's something I often talk to my patients about, is we are always running around. We're always looking at things and being exposed to things without any opportunity to really process it. So when I talk to my patients, I often talk about a balance between experience and expression. It's the yin and the yang. So when that is out of balance, that's where disease happens. So in life, experiences come our way. And if we take the opportunity to process them and express them in our own voice, then it comes to full circle. And over time, what I've recognized in my patients is that the more they go through that process, the more equanimity they develop. And what they realize is that there's nothing good, there's nothing bad. There's no right, there's no wrong. Because a lot of times our brain reflexively identifies, especially when you're sick, as everything being very right and very wrong. So by going through that process and finding that balance between life experience and expression, they find equanimity. And I cannot think of a better way to learn to express life experiences than through art. And I think we need to do a much better job at giving people tools and avenues to use expression as a way of healing. So thank you so much for this amazing event and this panel. And I just think, and there will be more events like this happening throughout the summer, thanks to the partnership between Lincoln Center and New York Presbyterian. So I hope you can take advantage of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.